This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 443, and it's May the 30th, 1980. Another month has gone by. It's side one of the tape. The music on the tape this week is from the play Evita again. Evita is nominated for 11 Tony Awards. Watch some of the scenes they'll have on television Sunday, June the 8th. I think you'll enjoy it. If you haven't seen the play already, be sure to see it. Speaking of Evita, the sister of Che Guevara is traveling in Washington, the United States. She lives in Spain, and she's appealing for help for the 20,000 to 30,000 people that are missing in Argentina. There's 30,000 that have disappeared. Some 15,000 are in prison. The others have been murdered by the military junta. And one of the primary characters is the part of Che Guevara in the play. He was brought up in Argentina and then went on to Cuba with Fidel Castro, and then into Bolivia, where Che was murdered by the Central Intelligence Agency. It's pretty common knowledge, the investigation, and the fact that people involved with murdering him have bragged about the role in killing Che Guevara in the jungle in 1967 in Bolivia. Che has a younger brother who's in jail. He's been in prison since 1975, a 10-year sentence. She says mostly because he does work with labor unions, and because of the Guevara name, the mother had been arrested. His brother is suffering. He's 36 years old from hepatitis and anemia and other diseases while in prison, and she was forced to leave the country. She has been threatened by the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance. It's a death squad that threatened to kill her. She was forced to leave there, and her father lives in Cuba. Another brother moved away. She's living in Spain, and she's come to the United States to ask for help because of the repression. The family and all their associates are under tremendous effort to free the political prisoners that number approximately 30,000. She says there's more than 30,000 people that have disappeared in Argentina. 15,000 have been imprisoned, and of course, the Human Rights Group have been working on that for a long time, but she's in the country. I hope she comes to the West Coast. I would like to hear her or meet her, and she's fighting hard to try and get some help for everyone in Argentina, and they themselves have suffered terribly through all of this. Che Guevara, in his writings and experiences, saw the United States as the chief source of imperialism for all the other Americas, and he worked with Fidel Castro on that, and I think he was right in his summation of what is going on with the labor unions and repressions of native populations all over the world. Che's name still rings such magic that all the family live in terror and can't live in Argentina at all because of what Che Guevara means to the masses of the population who still keep his picture and talk about him. Jack Anderson had an article May 18th, it was, on selective justice, and he barely hit at some of the areas I've been talking about. Jimmy Carter, the Carter peanut warehouse connections, and the finanglings of the finances down in Georgia, the Burt Lance affair, the complicated case that the jurors released Burt Lance. They were bored to death and couldn't understand the banking finagling. They were sympathetic to Lance in the first place. The Robert Vesco influence buying scandal that the Justice Department is hushing up with Georgia intimate Charles Kerbo, Carter's pal. The Hamilton Jordan narcotics case, the cocaine connections, the White House drug connections of Dr. Peter Byrne and drug legislation, the public integrity mystery. The Federal Times reported the integrity chief Thomas Henderson Jr. refused to prosecute more than a dozen cases against Carter administration officials, and then the selective ab-scam investigations that are being covered up, and various politicians are getting off the hook. The Justice Department is circumventing all of the links of Jimmy Carter to these very important narcotic connections and scandals as they keep mounting. Jack Anderson finally comes out with an article that one selective justice with one bracket, Carter Peanut Warehouse, another the Lance affair, the other the Vesco, the other the drug connections with Byrne, another category the public integrity mystery, another ab-scam, and so forth. In order to understand modern history or the way the news is folding, you have to put things into outlines and columns and add up the columns. It isn't the single stories that make the news, and that's the way I've done my work. That's the way I wrote my published articles. The ones I like the best are done in outline form. Forget the literary embellishment that goes with it. Just list the points, 1, 2, 3, and 4, And you have to do that sometimes, and this is what Anderson is doing with Jimmy Carter. Now, if he would get his outline and do the connections of Ronald Reagan to Paul Lassault, to the Summa organization, to the Central Intelligence Agency, to the casinos in Nevada, the organized crime, to the Hoover School of the Tsarist Russians, the Nazis, the fascists, if he did a background on Reagan to be equally as strict in his analysis of the two candidates, it would be wonderful. But right now, Jack Anderson, who is a devout Mormon, who has a restaurant business, or did with Madame Chenault of the CIA Flying Tigers fame, who also brought narcotics into this country, if Jack Anderson were really fair, he would attack Lassault. But Lassault worked with the Howard Hughes organization, which was the Mormon Mafia, set up with an entourage of Mormons that were a cover for a Central Intelligence operation. So that Anderson's pecking away, while it's very good and accurate, is always selective. He does a good job of part of the story, but the other half that protects his interests or his informants or his investments is always held from the people. And that is why we get into such dangerous situations, is that we rely on these analytical journalists and newspaper people to tell us the story, and they only tell us half the story. I never am too concerned about the candidates or the nominations going way back, and that's why I refuse to talk about the elections per se too much, is because I know, as this book is coming out that I mentioned last week, I know the candidates are selected a long time ago, and anyone else in their way is pushed aside, murdered, slipped out with whether it's Scotch tape or whatever. But one of the most interesting parts of the election year that has to be investigated, and I want to go at length with you as much as I can, is the voting machine. There's never been a really good analysis of the voting machine. But in New Hampshire, when Lyndon LaRoche came out so badly in his attempt to become president of the United States, he's running for the Labor caucus, which isn't a popular group anyway, but he does have one area where he has a footing, and all of a sudden he noticed, evidently, that the nuts and bolts of the voting machine are involved in fraud. And I don't think that the article in New Solidarity is a sour grapes article. I think it has information that has to be investigated, and I'm going to pass it on to you because there has never been a good description of who owns the voting machine companies. Now, in the New Solidarity, this is April the 25th, just this last month, there is a story about Mr. LaRoche knowing that he had a certain amount of votes, that there was a roster of over 20,000 voters in an area, and yet when the tally came in, it was very low. And the article goes on that there is a cover-up procedure in the voting machine, and that somebody came to him and tipped him off about how the voting machines are fixed. One of my pet peeves is that we can't go in with our right hand or our left hand and stamp that little X anymore, that we have to use a computer, and that I know computers can be arranged to make mistakes in these tallies by a manipulation of or sort, and it suggests here that a part is shaved off or tampered with that makes the voting come out different than what the person intended when they punched the little card. In this article on the voting machine, the nuts and bolts, there is a subtitle, Company Men. I'm going to read from this article now and share it with you. Take the International Election System Corporation, headquartered in Burlington, New Jersey. Now, it'd be interesting to know how close Burlington, New Jersey is to all his other crooks that are surfacing in the New Jersey area that are linked not only to Abscam, but the casinos, and to Agee Farben, and again, the Robert Vesco connections, and the Alpha 56, and the anti-Castro Cubans, and Princeton, New Jersey, with its testing for all the universities and occupations in the United States. New Jersey is a very interesting state. And in Burlington, New Jersey, there is the International Election System. The firm followed what was known as the SHOOP, S-H-O-U-P, voting machine. In 1950s, convicted stock manipulator Lewis Wolfson bought out SHOOP. He bought the SHOOP voting machine. It was a natural investment for him since Wolfson raised thoroughbreds, bankrolled election campaigns, counted the big names of politics, sports, and show business among his friends. In 1964, when Wolfson was under investigation for various corrupt practices, and this was Lyndon Johnson's closest buddy, he went to two law firms to represent him. One was Arnold, Fortas, and Porter, course, Abe Fortas was on the Supreme Court, and he was the lawyer who helped landslide Lyndon Johnson win in 1948, a very controversial election at the time where the senatorial race was changed. There were 200 lost votes, Johnson votes, 3 days after the election. And Abe Fortas has been a long friend of Lyndon Johnson. The other firm to represent Mr. Wolfson was Shea, S-H-E-A, Gallup, and Gould and Klemenko, headed by the New York power broker William A. Shea, who was chairman of the Shoup voting machine. Now, Mr. Wolfson, when he gets into trouble, goes to the law firm of Arnold, Fortas, and Porter, and then he goes to Shea, Gallup, Gould, and Klemenko in New York City. I don't know if Gallup is the Gallup poll that determines how we vote or what we vote or tells us what to vote. If this office involves the family or a member of Gallup polls, the Gallup poll people are also very politically conservative, arch conservatives, and I have filed away some articles on the Gallups. But here's a law firm, Shea, Gallup, Gould, and Klemenko, that was headed by a New York power broker by the name of William Shea of this firm, who was chairman of the Shoup voting machine company. So is Gallup related, that law office, to the voting machine company? The article goes on, in the early 1960s, and of course the takeover of the government was in 1963 when John Kennedy was killed, and then the voting machines could be manipulated maybe earlier, but in the early 1960s, Mr. Wolfson, Louis Wolfson, the close friend of Lyndon Johnson, involved with politics, sports, and show business, and so forth, sold Shoup, which he had bought, to the General Battery and Ceramic Company, which is now linked to British-dominated zinc mining. And one member of their society, according to this article, The New Solidarity, the Venerable Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, is on its board. William A. Shea is now involved with Shea Stadium, the New York Mets, horse racing, and is General Battery's chairman. I've talked on the last few tapes, or going back, on Madison Square Gardens and sports and espionage or organized crime links, the possibility of this can of worms, and you have William Shea of Shea Stadium and the New York Mets, and this gentleman as part, Mr. William Shea, is chairman of the Shoup voting machine. According to this article, in the late 60s, Shoup was acquired then by Macrodine, whose bank is Marine Midland of Buffalo, New York. And then New Solidarity makes the links of that bank to Hong Kong and Shanghai, where the golden triangle of the drug trade is in Asia. That would be very convenient to have the voting machine offices in New Jersey, the organized crime nest building up with the casinos in New Jersey and the Buffalo connections. The Macrodine company Shoup acquired is now part of the International Electronics System Corporation. The corporate history of the other voting machine, and there's another company that makes it, the AVM of Jamestown, New York, is just as enlightening. Rockwell International bought the company in the late 50s. The late 50s are when Richard Nixon was vice president, going to run for president, lost the election to John Kennedy. We were still, I believe, manually voting at that time. And then Kennedy was killed, and all of a sudden these slick push-button machines come in. This article refers to the late 50s. I'd like to know if it was 59 and a half, because remember, in April 1960, Robert Mayhew from the Howard Hughes Organization was sitting with members of organized crime, again from New Jersey, New York, Nevada, Chicago, Florida, and making arrangements for assassination hit teams, that the federal government would work with organized crime, with the Murder Incorporated that went east, west, and south to the Bahamas, and of course was international because of the narcotic connections. AVM of Jamestown, New York, was taken over by the Rockwell International interest. They bought the company in the late 50s, but it didn't protect the AVM from a well-orchestrated series of voting machine scandals that were carried out in 1969 to 73. Those are those controversial years of the Watergate, and after Robert Kennedy's assassination and Martin Luther King's, there were scandals of the Shoup and the AVM by the Justice Department's Organized Crime Strike Force. Now, I don't know, and I didn't save the articles of Those scandals, I wasn't aware of them at that time, the voting machine scandals. I should have been. I did have articles, I had them filed back, that Venezuela was the testing place for voting machines, and I mentioned on tapes or radio shows for a long time a scandal of voting machines and sending them down there for a South American election. But this article says there were investigations in 69 and to 73 by the Justice Department Organized Crime Strike Force. During one of the scandals involving the AVM voting machine, AVM hired Shoup's old firm of Arnold and Porter, the same one that had Abe Fortas as a justice of the Supreme Court that then stepped down, Lyndon Johnson's friend, and he helped them as their election specialist. Then during the voting machine scandals, they brought in Mitchell Rogovin, the attorney whose name is in the news all of the time, who turned these scandals of the voting machine kickbacks to Venezuela. Now, this article is important because it talks about Venezuela, and that's where I first got wind of the suspicion of irregularities in the voting machine scandal, going way, way back to Venezuela, and then the whole affair was swept under the rug. Rogovin then went on to be special counsel to the Central Intelligence Agency. And AVM, the voting machine company, and Shoup are moving on to the next election. They control the machines that you vote into. Evidently, they make the machines. Now, if it is true that the voting machines are made by Rockwell International and lawyers from the CIA and the Lyndon Johnson administration and the White House, or the possible links to Gallup and Gallup polls, it is scandalous. I have really hoped through the years, the last 4 years or so, I've mentioned it many, many times to various people personally, and I don't know if I've emphasized enough on the tapes, that the voting machines should be thrown out. They're worked in such a way that when your polls close on the East Coast, they tell us who's president. If it's 3 hours earlier out here, we don't even have to go to vote. All except the local politicians, the decisions are made in the East, the national. And the voting machine scandal maybe should be investigated more, and maybe because LaRoche was running for president and he realized how he was burned, he got into this subject. If he goes too far, he'll find his old buddies who've been manipulating a lot of other affairs. So I doubt if he'll go too far on this, but I think somebody else should pick up the ball and investigate these companies, Microdine and Rockwell. I'll put the names on the printed sheet that accompanies this tape, and maybe we should do much more work into the law firms that I've mentioned that are involved with the voting machine, and just find how closely they are related to the President of the United States and to the racetrack crowd and the world of politics and of sports and the New Jersey group, where the headquarters, New Jersey, Philadelphia, New York, the crime syndicate families are centered, as well as the headquarters in Vegas and Arizona and California. Before they moved west, they were on the East Coast, and it would be important to know that the links of this gang to the voting machine, because they not only have killed the President of the United States in office and killed the senator, his brother, the night of his primary victory in California, and shot and tried to kill George Wallace the night of his primary victory in Maryland and in Michigan, and dumped the chances. Well, Ted Kennedy never had a chance with the voting machine even, but who knows what they can do with these machines. I've suspected for a long time that they could file or do them a certain way so that when you punch it, the vote isn't going the way you think it's going. If a handful of people can lie about governments that they put into power all over the world and make a private war in Cambodia without telling Congress or any other person, and kill hundreds of thousands of people without you're getting access to that information and lying about the murder of a president, they have the technology and the mentality and the ability to manufacture these machines and suit them any way they want to make sure that if it comes to push and shove, the candidate they want will get the most buttons that day. Last week I talked about the incredible and Mr. Brzezinski with his Defense Department special agents inside the White House being armed, and the dangerous procedure of having this man have a small entourage of his own around the President of the United States. There's another article recently that came out from New York, an Associated Press story, that makes me concerned about the communication systems in this country, or the possibility of a coup and jamming the systems. The article came out about a school in New York City. It's a private school. The story begins, classroom computer mystery, the Great Dalton School computer tie-in mystery. The FBI is seeking a possible little Einstein who may have used a classroom computer to jam the New York City linked to 21 Canadian computer systems. People were outraged that it could happen, said the school teacher. The investigation is just taking place now, and I'm sure we won't find out any more about it when it's done than we did the voting machine scandals in the late 60s and early 70s, or the Venezuela scandals. But the FBI is investigating. The FBI says that apparently somebody found a way to tap into a link between two communication networks, the GTE Telenet and a communications corporation of Vienna, Virginia, and Bell Canada's DataPack system. That's 21 Canadian firms and universities are run by a computer system that they have access to this computer system. The FBI is investigating how the computers were tapped, and one company said many of their computer files have been destroyed. They wanted to get a search warrant to go into the New York Telephone Company, and when they checked out where this was coming from, it was located in this private school, the Dalton School, right in Manhattan on 89th Street, 108 East 89th Street. And they identified two plastic bags they found that were filled with computer printouts and a computer log sheet. And the cover-up was, we don't know if we have a frustrated professor or a little Einstein school. The Dalton School is a private school on Manhattan's exclusive East Side, run by a headmaster, Helga Gould. That's G-O-U-L-D. Again, I think of Jean Harris, the headmistress with the double life, who is linked to the Tarnower murder in Westchester, being the schoolma'am, the head of a private school. This school has 1,200 students, ages 3 to 18 years of age. There's 180 teachers, administrators, and clerks. And the headmaster wouldn't comment on how they had access to 4 computer terminals. And evidently this school is a front. They tapped into the DataPack Telenet link that requires the address of the computer to be tapped, identification codes, and passwords, and they got a hold of them. And of course they were blaming it on the 3- and 4-year-olds. They didn't know how people could get access to this information. As I say, they were looking for what they call a little Einstein. This computer at the Dalton School in New York that acquainted the children with the use of mysteries in the electronic age in some way is tied into this detailed, complicated computer system that involves GTE, GenNet, as I say, Communications Corporation in Virginia, subsidiary of General Telephone Electronics Corporation, and up to Bell of Canada. Access can be achieved by a telephone at a computer terminal. They have to use a password, an identification number, and so forth, and the telephone company located in their private school on 89th Street. Canadian computer subscribers were affected. The University of Toronto, Alberta, Waterloo, Concordia University, Bell Canada, Honeywell, and other corporations were all affected, according to an affidavit. An interesting way to jam computers, and it's similar to the book Sabotage that I've referred to on the tapes. Goodness knows where there are people located who have access to massive computers. At the time of the Kennedy assassination, the switchboards were cut off at the White House. This is a common technique that's been used over and over again at times of emergency. It's impossible to get through to the lines. A young person, a 20-year-old man who testified last year at the trial of 2 members of the Gambino family. It had to do with the killing of James Eppolito in New York City and his son, James A. Eppolito, the 2 Eppolitos. The man who testified at this trial as a witness in the trial was found shot to death in Brooklyn, bullets in his head, riddled with bullets. His name was Patrick Penny. That little obituary was not on the page of the usual deaths in the New York Times. That article about Patrick Penny is just 3 inches long, and I found in the second section on page 3, May the 14th, that the witness in this trial, the man who testified against the men who are charged with the gangland slaying of the Eppolitos, the father and the son, he has been murdered, and the man that he testified against, the men that he testified against, Anthony Agee and Peter Piacenti were convicted of lesser crimes than murdering these two people. Well, you have to go back again to the Maxine Cheshire article. This was December the 2nd, 1979, just at the beginning of this year, about the White House party, the connections of Agent John Ellsworth of Secret Service, FBI, CIA, the counterintelligence agent who was in the White House with Rosalyn and Jimmy Carter. A long article in the Washington Post that I did on my tapes on Eppolito and the murders, that these two men had to be murdered because they were so close to Rosalyn Carter. Young Eppolito had had his picture taken with Rosalyn Carter in that Cities for Schools, a charity affair, and they were lining up contributions from labor leaders and so forth and Teamsters, but they were too close to the Jimmy Carter White House team and were photographed with Rosalyn Carter, so these mobsters were shot down to death last October. And the Washington Post Maxine Cheshire had an article about that, and also the Gaddafi connections to Jimmy Carter and Vesco, the same article. A complicated can of worms, but the point was that the Eppolitos had to be murdered because they were photographed with the Carters and they were too close to the Carter administration. Then the man that testified against the murderers was killed this last week, and the men that murdered these two people got off on lesser charges. Again, a shocking kind of link to the White House, to organized crime, to the Gambino family. They were members of the Gambino family. There's endless links of the mafia, the Georgia mafia, the Jimmy Carter connections, the Gambino family, and to many of these violences or deaths that are taking place. So the witness to the slaying, the man who testified, he's dumped with a bunch of bullets in his head, 9 shots in his head. The two that did the murders of the Eppolitos got lesser charges and weren't charged with murder, and now this witness is wiped out. And it doesn't make much sense to a person to read this section, second section, New York Times, tucked away in a little tiny column at the back of the page, except when you read the Washington Post and you put pieces together from various newspapers, you realize the connections to not only to the White House, to many of the scandals that are coming out now, the links of Gambino to Sindona, Michael Sindona, and the Vatican and the CIA. There is a network of organized crime, and White House, public officials, Justice Department, police departments, the courts, the judges seem to be under total control of the crime figures and the witnesses to the trial who fingered the murderers to get gunned down like dogs on the street, with hardly a connection to how important it was to identify who was doing this killing and why they had to be killed at the time. There was a fire at the UCLA campus last week. The Orthodox Jewish house, the Chabad house, burned down on Gailey. $1 million damage, 3 Jewish students killed. At first they said it was arson because there were death threats before. Then they said it was a bad electrical wire. And then there was another article on death threats that they had received there at this house, and 3 Jewish students were killed at UCLA. That's right, in the heart of Los Angeles, the University of California. As the Los Angeles Times described, fire kills 3 in Jewish group's headquarters, $1 million damage, 2 others were injured, and they suspect arson. I mentioned last week the leaks coming out about our Iranian invasion and other matters from Hong Kong. Birch Bayh asked the FBI to investigate leaks on missions to Iran. That was May the 8th in the Washington Post. And Evans and Novak had an article May the 7th, intelligence leaks are out of control. It may just be that those leaks are saving us from an atomic war or a Holocaust, and that those people who are making the leaks are doing their best to stop a World War III. That's what I think they're doing. On the other side of this tape, I'm going to run down a series of articles that have been on my desk in the past 2 weeks that I want to share with you before I put them into the files and lose track of them. And instead of staying on one specific subject, I'm just going to give you some of the most interesting highlights, and some we'll get back to at a later time, but I don't, as I say, don't want to lose track of them right now. The subscribers to these tapes sent me a page from a book on the life of Queen Victoria, and the statement that she was very anxious to make war with the Russians, that if she were a man she'd give the Russians a beating, and that she wouldn't be satisfied until they could fight it out. With this intertwining link of competition between Russia and England is interesting in the Nobel family, and there have been books or studies that I've referred to on other tapes that the Russians were promised the techniques of railroads and industrialization to produce and transport their oil in exchange for their helping the North at the time of the American Civil War, and the suggestion and implication that the killing of Lincoln had as much to do with his cooperating with Russia against Great Britain as for many other reasons, that Abraham Lincoln had to be murdered because of this. There has always been a battle over the seas and across the continents to capture and gain land, and Queen Victoria was very much a part of those land grabs, and I suppose she would like to have taken on the Soviet Union in many ways. I got another article from back east from another subscriber, a very interesting one by Alexander Cockburn and James Ridgway on Tehran and Iran, because we all know that there are many elements going on and combating each other that have not been told to us about the taking of the hostages, or why events are transpiring in the Middle East with our fleet there and our getting us on the stage of World War III because of those hostages at the embassy. And this article brings up something that I haven't understood, and I want to share it with you, and maybe we'll put our heads together on it. At the time when the Shah was kicked out of the country, the embassy in Washington had many files. They intimated and even acknowledged of various members of Congress that were in the pay of the Shah of Iran about the terrible Savak in the United States, and certainly the Savak must be existing in some form in Iran right now. All of those people, the military, police, and so forth, didn't suddenly become anti-Shah. They're playing some role there. And this article is about the fifth column, who was waiting in Tehran, and one aspect they brought up, they call it in the Village Voice, the buried past. A remarkable aspect of the Iranian Revolution is that the secrets of the quarter century of tyranny still remain hidden. If the Shah was so bad and kicked out, why are they keeping the secrets? And they said, amid the unceasing hubbub of anti-American rhetoric, the leaders of the revolution have had remarkable discretion in disclosing the dealings of the Shah, of various foreign corporations, of politicians, of journalists, and government officials. And they bring up the fact, why are they holding this back? If the Shah was so bad, if the journalists have been paid off in America, if the public officials are in the pay of this kind of a regime all these years, and they have information on it, why are they letting this out? I know that the Panamanian group were presented with 600 pages of documents on problems, torture, and killings in Iran. That was presented the day that the Shah arrived, but that's been suppressed and hasn't been printed. The United Nations sent a group over to investigate the crimes of the Shah, representatives from different countries, headed by Mr. Waldheim, and we've never seen a printed page of what the Iranian people told them. Well, if they're making hundreds of pages of documents, why don't they present some of this to show what was going on? Who in the government is suppressing this? They had pictures on television of the shredding machines that only cut in lines, and they put together, women were putting together all the pieces of documents of intelligence operations, and yet they don't reveal what they glued together. Is this the bargaining power for later to keep us from further activity there, or when are they ever going to produce this information? Now, the Village Voice gives some examples. They said shortly after the Shah fled Cairo and the embassy in Iran, the Washington embassy was taken over by the revolutionaries. Reporters clamored for public disclosure of what were damning documents concerning payoffs and bribes of people in the United States. Acting ambassador to the United States, Rouhani, claimed he sent these files back to Tehran. In Tehran, Mr. Rouhani's father, Mr. Yazdi, Y-A-Z-D-I, a close associate of Khomeini, said that the files were lost. This would be the best leverage Khomeini could have if he really wanted them. They give another example. Last summer, a visit to the Ministry of National Guidance in Tehran spotted on the cluttered desk of the Secretary to Minister Minaha several letters disclosing payoffs from the Shah to the United States government to American journalists. The Secretary was preparing to throw the letters in the wastebasket. The visitor said, could he take them? And after much discussion, this person became involved. He proposed to copy the letters and deliver them to the visitor, but when the visitor left, these copies never arrived. They evidently were destroyed. And they point attention to the fact that withholding of information would buttress, by withholding this information, it would buttress the support of the previous regime. And by not exposing the Shah and his accomplices and agents, the beneficiaries are using it for some purpose, but I can't imagine why they're holding it back unless they're part of the CIA group that put in Khomeini and Zbigniew, and all of them are actually working for the CIA. The Shah is out, and we control both governments. They said within a month of the seizure of the power, Ayatollah Talabani, key member of the Revolutionary Council, informed another visitor that the council had reached a consensus. The revolution would mount a third world equivalent of a Nuremberg tribunal and would bring up all the parties of the Shah that would be brought to trial, and they would bring up before the tribunal. But the curtain was abruptly dropped on the idea of the tribunal, and it goes into other people who had information of atrocities and pictures of tortures and victims, and they were going to have 500 material witnesses. Nothing came of this, and they noted the suppression of evidence and rapid extermination of witnesses soon provoked a question. Who had such a manifest interest in the Iranian government that's there now to hide the deeds and the data of the Shah's years, and why are they hiding it? In any post-revolutionary situation, they would be delighted to display this information to justify what they are doing. And they go into Zbigniew and Bashida himself and various persons in the government, Yazdi, that are not allowing this information out, that are protecting the Shah, protecting the past administration. And how much of a revolution can it be if they refuse to reveal or destroy the evidence that they're talking about? This article calls attention to the fact that many of the Shah regime lived abroad. Mr. Beheshti was in West Germany. 3 were in the United States. Their past appears murky. They were all activists in the Muslim student organization, the MSA. The MSA is linked to the American Friends of the Middle East. That's a group that Leon Jaworski and John Connolly and the Southern group particularly were linked with for years. The Friends of the Middle East has been identified as a CIA organization, a conduit of CIA money. One of the directors was Kermit Roosevelt, who put the original coup in that put the Shah into power against Premier Mossadegh. And 2 of their leaders, Takharim and Yazdi, I don't know if I pronounced them right, left the MSA, that's the Muslim Student Association, and now are active in the anti-Shah group in the early 60s. But the article points out that the lines between the CIA and the different groups are blurred, that there's a connection between the Muslim Student Association and the Central Intelligence Agency, and it goes on to other points in the article, but the important thing is that everywhere along the line they talk about the crimes, but they don't reveal them. They could expose the people in Congress who are in the pay of the Shah, and they don't. They could expose the journalists in the United States who were under the pay of the Shah, but they don't. How long are they going to hold us back, or is all of this being destroyed, or was the Shah moved out so a new group would come to power, but the new group have influence just as great? Now, I ask this question because I keep bringing this up over and over, that I believe one of the most lucrative and most important elements in the entire world today is the role of narcotics and organized crime, gun smuggling and narcotics, and then with it goes extortion, blackmail, prostitution, gambling, and all the rackets and business franchises of the crime syndicate. When the Shah was moved out, the narcotics market just poured and gushed. This new administration has allowed that to be possible. And I wonder if the crimes of the Shah were so much greater than the fact that they wanted to take over the opium, narcotics, hashish traffic from the entire Middle East and take it away from the Shah's family and exchange the distributors. There is a narcotics war going on now among the top bosses, but the crimes of the Shah aren't as important as the billions and billions of dollars that are pouring into this country in narcotics. And I think the secret to the change of governments in Iran has as much to do with narcotics, war, and traffic as it has to do with the crimes of the Shah. There's an article on heroin cost cuts police probe in Washington, D.C. The fact that it's hard to find heroin agents because they have to have cash to make a fix, and an ounce of heroin of pure quality is now selling for $12,000. If that's possible, it's hard to believe, but that's what they say. 4 years ago, the price was $1,400. So an ounce of gold doesn't sell for $12,000, and the name of the game really has to be the narcotic market, and the market is never ending, and once the traffickers get hands on those huge kinds of profits, there's no way to end the spiraling, and the supply just keeps going on and on. There's no way to cut it off. There was an article about I.F. Stone in the Chicago Sun-Times. Ex-muckraker covers the Greek beat, and it tells how he's translating Cicero and various writers, Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and so forth, his love of Plato and Greek. I.F. Stone is the great godfather of the so-called pseudo-liberal left in this country, a member of the OSS. He ran a newspaper during the Vietnam, South Korean War, his little newsletter. His role is to constantly put down any suggestion of a conspiracy in the United States, a conspiracy to kill John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. I don't see how a man who was involved with social problems and social progress or the decline of any part of our society could suddenly change rules and go away just into the classical field and ignore what is happening today. He's been a provocateur. He's been controversial. I've been accused of suggesting that he was in the pay of the employment agencies. If you watch Philip Agee's three-part series on television, I mentioned it several weeks ago on the CIA doesn't have to infiltrate the private clubs, the yacht clubs, the Harvard Crimson, the Princeton organizations. They take the left. They have left journalists, left labor leaders, left women's movement groups, left organizations, because those are the ones they want to take over, disrupt, break up, discredit. If any organization of a small group is making progress, the agent ratio is about 1 to 6 or 1 to 5. You don't have to have a card to say, I'm a member of the CIA to help the CIA or the American Gestapo. All you have to do is break apart and break the credibility of those people who are exposing the system and turn on them and get people to turn their back on those people not to listen. And I.F. Stone has been a very valuable provocateur in that sense of diverting people from the very important truths that are going on. And then he took the cop-out and went into his classical literature at a time when it was very important to make the connecting links of fascism around the world and at home to various election mismanagements, assassinations, conspiracies, the way we're losing what was given to us in the Constitution by purposeful manipulation. Anybody with an ounce of curiosity shouldn't drop out from his investigation. He should stay with it as long as he's alive. There's a book out that the National Labor Caucus is putting down naturally. They go ad infinitum about it. They're making such a big scene. I haven't read this book, but it's another one that I want to get. The Aquarian Conspiracy, Personal and Social Transformation in the 80s by Marilyn Ferguson. The idea is that you have a leaderless society, that you have a powerful network working to bring about radical change in the United States. That's the theme of the book, to bring in human consciousness of people who are against the kind of violences that are taking place, but who are not an organization. They believe that America should be free, that the states and the country should be free, and that there is a conspiracy among the Aquarian age to drop out and get it together psychologically and psychically to resist war and weapons, to create what she describes as a better world, a continuation of what happened in the 60s taking place in the 80s. I would say that there is a lot of basis for what is referred to as the Aquarian conspiracy, at least among many of the people I know, to drop out and individually do your part and not be part of the war machine or the mechanics, but not belong to an organization. Organizations are taken over. Organizations are infiltrated. There is used to be power in numbers, but there isn't anymore. And unless we can figure things out ourselves with a higher ideal or a goal, there never are going to be changes in society. I don't know if we can get enough people to figure it out themselves. They're so brainwashed between the media and television and radio and narcotics and alcohol, tobacco, poison food, and so forth. I don't know whether the body is capable of resisting the double whammy it's getting with all the poisons and chemicals that do get to the brain. But I believe that the idea of the Aquarian age of not having organizations is important. And I will read the book, but the Labor Caucus is fighting it very hard, and yet I think that it's important as owning a weapon is the state of mind of what you want and then being able to bring it about psychically. I think that that is one of the possibilities of counteracting some of these evil forces today. This doesn't sound very practical to some of you, I know, and I think I could go both ways. I think I could get very radical and violent if the time came, and I think I can stay psychically attuned to figuring out some of the problems and seeing them unravel without the bullets flying. There is an awful lot coming out these days. The problem of psychosurgery is in the news again. It seems that these old evils, these evil people, these evil acts keep recurring over and over again. The Washington Post has an article that the Cabinet of Health and Human Services, the Secretary Patricia Hearst, is considering the use of Medicaid and Medicare money for brain operations. They're trying to limit the use of psychosurgery operations, they meaning Dr. Peter Breggin. I'll give you his address. He's one of the best, most dedicated public servants, freedom fighters in the United States. And that bibliography that I have of important books to read, those of you who don't have it should receive a copy from me. Send a self-addressed stamped envelope if you don't have this list of books. I made this list out a few years ago of important books to read, and I'll send you a list. And in the order of importance of books that you should have to understand these various conspiracies, I listed first Project Paperclip by Clarence Lansby, the importation of these Nazi criminals who are also part of this psychosurgery program, Cookridge's book, Galen Spy of the Century, then my 3 articles, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped?, the Senate Select Committee is part of the cover-up, and the SLA is the CIA. Then under that was Dr. Peter Breggin, Center for Study of Psychiatry. You should get his books, Right to Research, and get the books on mind control, particularly the one by Dr. Delgado at Yale. And then the next group of researchers, the most important group, are Vaughn Young from Freedom, who's written a book on Interpol with the links of the Odessa, the Nazis, the drug connections, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and so forth. And then Jim Hogan's article, A Surfeit of Spies, on Intertel, which is the Justice Department, the FBI, and federal agents running Resorts International and gambling in casinos in Bahamas and Nevada, and also now in New Jersey. Those are terribly important to read. The Paperclip, the Galen, my articles, the one by Peter Breggin, his group, and you can send to him. He has tape cassettes, and he has books. He has a tape on the politics of psychosurgery and the story of Interpol, the Operation Ajax, and also Intertel. But Breggin is fighting again in Congress. They want to use the psychosurgery. They did lobotomies between 1940 and 1950. 40 to 50,000 Americans had brain operations, and now they do them quite neat with a needle that goes through the eye. They don't even open up the whole skull and affect a part of the brain. I wonder, besides the corrupt voting machines, how these 40 or 50 lobotomized people are voting. There's no law against going to the voting machines and just plunking your hand down for a vote, but I wonder how many of those even had lobotomies and know who they're voting for. There's no correlation between mental sickness and the ability to vote, and these people are out in society. They're not labeled, and goodness knows how many of them just had their thinking and their politics and their emotions removed. Well, now they want to use federal money again to bring back the lobotomies, and Dr. Breggin wants to stop it. Again, Dr. Thomas Ballantyne from Massachusetts General Hospital He's pushing this psychosurgery, this mutilation of the brain. Dr. Peter Breggin is trying to stop it. And a Charles Krauthammer, I don't know if he's a Project Paperclip Krauthammer or not, he's the science director for HHS, Alcohol, Drug Abuse, and Mental Health Administration in Rockville. And these people are trying to rationalize the use of prefrontal lobotomies and psychosurgery. One more time, it's interesting that very clean-cut men in business suits with Harvard, New England accents, and working at these Massachusetts hospitals debate the value of psychosurgery and lobotomies back and forth, but they don't parade the patients. How come they don't parade those patients? A listener from New York sent me an article on Leonard Keeley. I'm going to share that with you and do one whole tape soon on updating of mind control. I want to do one update on the Alternative 3 in the space program, and I'll get back to mind control later. I'll take a few of these isolated articles and do that as an entire subject on the effect of these people at Massachusetts General. And the very people that want to do this work were stopped by Sam Ervin in the Senate committee in 1975 from some of their shenanigans. But we keep going back to the Middle Ages. If you don't study the past and the history, if you don't get active in these things now, if you don't know the cast of characters, the others keep going and come back with a new power resurgence, and you have to keep watching them all the time. I mentioned tapes a while back that two of the doctors involved with the mind processing, the psychosurgery, and so forth were also involved with becoming experts on the prison riots in New Mexico, where the 39 informers were murdered that evening. The files were taken out, and the cell was broken down, and these people were killed. We haven't heard a word about that. That's been very quiet, the investigation of the prison riots, and again, I suppose we never will hear too much about that, even though there's some lawsuits pending. They'll be about as effective as the Kent State lawsuits and be lost for posterity. The facts of that case will never be told. There's an investigation going on in the House of Representatives about airplanes carrying explosives, safety of transportation. Mr. John Burton from California has been challenging some of the Federal Aviation Administration people, and again at this trial came up the fact that the Chilean airline brings in explosives that prior to the time that Letelier was killed in the United States, Orlando Letelier, the former Chilean ambassador, they brought in explosives on passenger airplanes before and after, and a non-pilot landed an airplane in Chile with explosives on it, that airplanes coming in from other countries are transporting themselves back and forth and bringing ammunition into the United States and out, and then some of it is later being used to kill people inside the United States. DINA, the Chilean secret police, works closely with the police in Washington, D.C., and of course the headquarters for all of their operations are down in Colonial Dignidad, the same house, camp, farm, religious church front that holds Nazi war criminals, the border between Argentina and Chile, that were responsible for the killing of Letelier and Sandra Moffat in Washington, D.C. So now they're investigating airplanes carrying explosives, but the people in Chile that were responsible for the murders in the United States have never been sent here and never will be. They're responsible for those murders in Washington. These bombs and explosives, according to these allegations of various witnesses, and Michael Townley particularly, he carried explosives right in the passenger compartment of transportation planes that were used for regular passenger use, and that the explosives are kept on these kinds of planes, and that the security is lax at the airport. They let them through, and they can carry the explosives with them. Dr. Ernest Lefevre, according to the Washington Post, a president of the Washington-based Ethics and Public Policy Center, which has been nothing but a CIA front, asked the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence that Congress let the clergy be CIA agents, that journalists be CIA agents, that missionaries can work for the CIA, that the CIA should be able to pose as a journalist, to pose as a geologist, or even a medical missionary. In other words, the CIA should be allowed to do anything it has to do, and if you go to a priest, if you go to a newspaper man with a story, if you see a crime committed and you go to a journalist, you won't know if that is a journalist or a member of the Savak or the Gestapo or the DINA or the CIA. You will not be able to tell the story to the journalist, because if the journalist is an agent, he will not carry it on. Now, this isn't a hypothetical. This has been going on continuously. The stories of the assassinations in this country, the murders, the connecting links of murders to people high up in government is given to journalists, and they kill the story. People disguised as writers kill the story, receive documents that they never pass on, don't want the stories to be carried. And at the time of the Senate hearings, Senator Church's hearings on the CIA, I think it came out that there were 250 journalists that belonged to the intelligence community. So whatever this organization is, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, I'm sure it's funded by the Defense Department or the National Security Agency, and when the CIA needs a new charter or needs to justify its infiltration behind its clerical garb or its typewriter or whatever, a geologist is looking for rocks and he's actually spying or sabotaging on a country. When your scientists and your priests and your press all turn to spies, you get a reign of terror that never can be undone. This is happening right now, and I'm sure Latin and South America and Asia and all over the world. If you go to the priest, if you go to the rabbi, if you go to the newspaper person, if you have something to tell to somebody and you're afraid or you've seen something wrong, and that person is an agent, what happens is the person who tells or sees gets killed. It's like the fellow in New York that gets killed because he saw the Eppolito murder and was asked to testify. The one who sees it gets offed, and the journalist, the priest, the scientist keeps the secret and works for the government. The government, whether, again, it's DINA, Savak, Gestapo, CIA, National Security Agency, there are no boundaries, and this is the way the government is taken over between the satellite communication systems and all sources of privacy and information being run by a select few. There is nowhere for the people to possibly turn. There is another point I want to bring up with you on this tape that I think you have to consider seriously, and even though I keep hitting at Jimmy Carter and the drug connections, I will be getting to Ronald Reagan and the fascist connections in the next week or two. I'm pulling out of my file some of the great Reagan stories from when he was governor of California. To tell you the truth, I think I've actually avoided it. It's like sitting down and eating your own puke. The idea that you've seen this man hand-selected as the President of the United States 12 or 15 years ago, and then you watch him move up and up and up, it's outrageous. Now, what is the other choice? It's Jimmy Carter with Brzezinski running the saddle with his team in the White House, weapons in hand. I don't think they would kill Jimmy Carter to have Mondale as President of the United States, so there'd have to be a double coup where the President and the Vice President are killed at the same time. But if it's Jimmy Carter and Brzezinski, because Brzezinski really runs the White House, forget Mondale. If it's Jimmy Carter and Brzezinski versus Ronald Reagan and Mr. Casey and the Gestapo from the Hoover Library out here in California, there is one primary difference, and you have to watch that very, very closely. And that is that there are justices on the Supreme Court that would be replaced. And don't believe for 1 second that there is any similarity between a Jimmy Carter selection and a Ronald Reagan selection. Ronald Reagan has said that he doesn't believe you have to have a lawyer as a justice of the Supreme Court. He made a Mr. Clark from San Luis Obispo a justice, a non-lawyer. He believes that corporate heads should be heads of the Supreme Court. Jimmy Carter, in his 3 years as president, has had a high percentage of liberals on the court. He's tried to use women and minorities, and he's tried to be fair, and Ronald Reagan wouldn't. And if you have to face the future with justices of the Supreme Court, even if Ronald Reagan only lives 1 year after, you're going to live with those justices. So there is no way to divide the vote, to go for anyone like Anderson or these splinter parties, or to be really crazy, or even to write in Mae Brussell. There's no way to split the vote if it's Reagan versus Jimmy Carter when it comes to that, because the selection of the justices is terribly important. 5 U.S. justices are over 70 years of age. Mr. Brennan, the senior, is 74. He's had radiation treatment for a malignant tumor on his vocal cords, and he had a stroke last year. Thurgood Marshall is 71. He's overweight. He's 13 years on the bench. He's not in good health. He's had mild heart attacks, and he's missed 200 cases from the last year because he fell and hit his head and his elbow and his wrist. There was a suggestion in an article in San Jose Mercury last week or so that maybe these ailing justices should get off the bench and retire while Jimmy Carter's still president and not give in that the seats be filled by Ronald Reagan. That is possible, but not probable. This is a dangerous age of rigged voting machines, political assassinations, corrupt and stupid leaders, but out of it we have to find some sanity. I hope you do. Have a good week. The time is out, and we'll be back with these corruptions again next week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.